Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Straight Talk, sponsored by Darley and Inglis. I'm Brent O'Brien, and joining me as per usual is Tim Rowe. Today, where to for stallion fees? A special interview with David Price on the success of Price Bloodstock, the damn sire dominance of Street Cry, plus foal amnesties. In racing, Steve McMahon moves into the ATC hot seat on a permanent basis. So Delius gets a Cox Plate path, and much to gain from the final day of the Sydney Autumn Carnival. While in wagering, the big bookies back on top, and the possible impact of prediction markets in Australia. Tim, thanks for joining us as always. We're at the time of the year where stallion fees are going to be announced over the next few weeks. There'll be plenty of stories on the straight, no doubt, and you and I will probably get a bit dizzy from trying to cover off all the farms announcing them. But overnight, we had Extreme Choice announced at 385,000. Probably not surprising that he goes to the highest price of any stallion in Australia. Last week we had Yarraman pretty much steady on sort of where things sit. I mean, the market seems fairly realistic, doesn't it, Tim? That the top end stallions that have proven themselves over the last year, they will get a price bump, but it's unlikely that you're probably going to see many others sort of go that same way, is it?
Yeah, I think, stallions or stud masters the stallions are really gonna have to prove themselves to earn a fee increase, and obviously Extreme Choice has, and as we all know, there's a scarcity value with the Extreme Choices, and I think it was $7 million yearlings you had at Easter. What I took out of the Newgate announcement, talking to Bruce Slade yesterday, was interesting about, as we know, the sort of commercialization of the market and probably the dropping out of the hobby breeders or breed to race types is to be commercial, you've basically got to try and find yourself in the top 3,000 foals, which is sort of, 30%, top 30% of the foal crop. Even though it is declining, it's still, that's easier said than done, of course. You've got to have the quality of mare and then a lot of luck. But it's interesting, even, you go to got 15 stallions, that's the way they're trying to push their clients. And as Bruce points out, and I wrote in the story, that there's not that many first season stallions this year, so that probably complicates matters for commercial breeders trying to figure out where they head if you can't get into or can't justify going to the very top.
Yeah, that 30% line is kind of interesting. If you look at that and you're talking, yeah, so you're talking probably 3,000, less than 3,000 foals. And if you look at in Australia in terms of yearlings, I think it's about 5,000 are sold through the yearling sales most years, around about that mark. And we've been to enough yearling sales to know, that probably half of those don't, don't make their money back. So it is I guess, there's an element where people say, "Oh, well, sire fees have to come, the service fees have to come down to represent the increasing cost of production, but also the risk that's involved with it." But it is an interesting one. Like, I said, Extreme Choice is an extreme example, so we're not going to use him as an example. But if you look at a lot of those other sires, they have, in terms of the numbers that have risen, they've definitely moderated over recent years. We had that bump sort of post-COVID where everybody was happy to sort of try to, push the market out a little bit more. But I can't. What is interesting is I can't see it going backwards significantly, but as you allude to there, there's probably fewer and fewer stallions that people are going to take risks on in terms of standing them. And this year in particular, we're seeing that there's not going to be a whole host of stallions sort of, in that space. And even that, if you look at like Vinrock was an example where I think he's 22,000. He probably a few years ago would have had a 3 in front of him. That's just the nature of where things sit. And so we had a bit of a chat with Sam Fairgrave, which I think we mentioned before at Easter sale, and where Sam said, "Well, look, we kind of got to make sure we're in the right spot in the market to get enough, you know, mares in to make sure they get the quality, to make sure they get the quantity in order to give them the best chance of success."
Definitely, and as we've spoken about before, you long have got the mares to support them, but you still want a client base that can hopefully make money out of the Vinrocks. And Hellbent did earn his fee increase to 50,000, and probably justified. He's had another good year, and just probably one of those slow burns that just consistently produces or gets a good horse. And there's not that many of them out there at the moment, or there's a few that are promising that the next few years will tell the tale.
Yeah, and that middle market also, that middle high end market, that I guess that 100,000 market, Tim's probably the question mark at the moment. How many horses? There's probably not a lot that are going to step into that space. Yeah, we'd probably see Home Affairs get a boost this year, obviously based on, and I think Coolmore's going to be announced the next few days, or maybe next week. But and a couple of others. I'd be interested to see where Super Set sits, all those things. Well, we'll discuss those as we go through. But it is an interesting market whereby the majority of stallions are not increasing, and that's a difference from probably 2 or 3 years ago. We also had a good chat, Tim. You had a good chat earlier in the week with David Price. Now, talking about Australian bloodstock and the importance of the Hong Kong market to Australia, the investment from Hong Kong is a massive and probably hard to quantify amount, isn't it, Tim? In terms of trying to work out how much money investors from Hong Kong spend in Australia. It's easy to sort of pick up the numbers at the yearling sales and the 2-year-old sales, but we don't see the amount of tried horses. And this is the model that Price Bloodstock, who had their 1,000th win in Hong Kong on Sunday, that I sort of worked through, getting horses in Australia, bringing them through the Australian system, give them a couple of starts over here, and then bring them to Hong Kong.
It's quite a remarkable story what David and his wife Jenny Chapman have been able to achieve over, as he says, started as a hobby. And quite often the horses don't, they're given trials and sold off trials, so they don't even have a start. But anyone that's followed any racing will see their colours, the Western Bulldogs, hoops red, white and blue, and that they support a lot of trainers, sort of mostly Victorians and the Jollies in South Australia to educate up their horses. They run a very, they have a lot of fun, that group, but especially with their naming and different things, but they run a very tight ship. It's clearly very well run to get 1,000 wins up there and make it all work and pay the bills, because as we know, having that number of horses in work is very expensive.
Yep, and here's a bit of an extract of your chat with David Price earlier in the week.
Yeah, just it's sort of one of those little hobbies that morphed into something bigger, and it's sort of, before you know it, it probably means we're getting old. It's taken a bit of a journey, but now it's been good. Produced some really good talent, and that was always the plan, to send good horses to Hong Kong to keep Hong Kong racing to the fore or play a little role. And it's been a good ride for sure.
Has it sort of changed much? Well, first of all, your relationships that you must have developed with owners and trainers to be able to sell that many horses, quality horses, to get that number of wins, says a lot about how it operates.
Yeah, look, we're never complacent. Hong Kong owners can be, can have their challenges at times, but deservedly so. They all want good horses, and they're all willing to sort of try different people, different suppliers, is, I think, is the best way of putting it. And there's certainly, I've got some terrifically loyal ones, and some come, some go, some come back. It's the nature of the game. But we're always forever trying to produce the right horses. Sometimes the horses don't follow the script as much as you would like, but that'll never change.
Has the scale surprised you of how big your operation's probably got? With we see your colours running around Australia regularly.
Oh, look, it probably has, because it was never anything more than a hobby, and I've probably had a share in a racehorse since I was 16 years old, and I've never been bored at looking through pedigrees and watching races. I'm probably a bit of a round the clock workaholic on racing, so it's an industry that as I say, we live a passion, really.
Yeah.
If you're lucky enough in racing and you're all in, you are living a passion. So this is probably the pathway our passion ended up finding itself. It's probably taken a couple of detours along the way, but this is something that just started out as a little bit of a hobby back in mid-90s, and I think Silent Witness, obviously, you could say, put us on the centre stage, and then the challenge after that was not to think of using that as an excuse for lowering the bar. They're difficult to get horses that good, but we've had a number of Group horses, Group 1 winners since. So it's we've always been striving to do the best, and as you say, Footy and Merrick and the likes of Paddy Payne and Billy's on the ground at the sales. So it's the role that a lot of people play back in Oz that probably at the end of the day puts my name in lights, but I think there's probably people that are more deserved to get the accolades.
Have you learned over the years the style of horse to try and buy that suits up there? Has it changed, or? Yeah.
I've got to say, I'm someone who does see a lot of humour in a lot of things, and I think the sales cliches never cease to amuse me. Apparently there's so many boxes you're meant to tick. I had a homebred filly down there a few years ago, didn't get to the races, and we named her Ticks No Boxes. And unfortunately, she didn't get to the races for that reason. So the only box he ticked was slow.
Well, I think that the 2 winners last night probably sum it up, and this is not blight on the stallions, but in terms of commerciality, one was by needs further than Elite Golf that brought up the thousandth win by Frosted.
I sat with Jim McGrath for 10 minutes yesterday. I always love having a chat with Jim, and he was discussing Frosted, and almost in that exact vocabulary of like, why would you buy a Frosted? And I've got a great relationship with Footy and Merrick, and I don't waste my time giving them a list. I might do the catalogue, but I don't give them a list. They give me numbers, and every now and again they match up, and plenty of times they don't. The focus is always on the individual, which sort of can sometimes hinder a sale because, I might be throwing up a new stallion that they've never heard of, and then someone will go, well, I've never heard of that. I'd rather buy something I've heard of. So, but we've sort of stuck to the model, and they do turn up, and they're usually nice horses, but by the time they get on a plane, we do feel that they've ticked enough boxes to warrant a trip to Hong Kong. But look, I wouldn't say. I think rule one to me is there are no rules.
Yeah, and correct me if Merrick thought He Was Me might have been even a replacement horse, which you tend to do, hopefully not too often. But
not too often. No, He Was Me was I think Footy bought him. He was a Tassie. We won a maiden with him at Swan Hill. I don't want to say anything negative towards the syndicate, but it was quite a limited budget horse. They didn't want to spend a lot. I thought he might be a little bit better than he's turned out to be, but it's an amazing thing in Hong Kong. A Class 5 winner can still be extremely well received, even though, back home it might be something that's winning at Donald on a Saturday, but it's still, at the end of the day, it's still front and centre. We still get photos with all our friends, and it still carries a fair bit of weight. So, yeah, look, I think, we certainly don't shop at the show-off level. We're always sort of doing our best to pick the eyes out of sales. And as I say, I can't speak highly enough of we've been doing this for a long, long time, and I got to say, I don't think there's ever been a day where we've told each other to F off or anything like that. It's just, I appreciate what they do, and I know we buy slow ones, not deliberately, but that's when you buy them in numbers. They seem to sell a lot of slow ones for some reason.
But Merrick and Footy, they're probably different personalities, and I enjoy the company of both of them, but do they buy different styles of horses, do you think, or are they sort of...
Paddy's there. So, like Billy's over the years, Billy's gone to the sales. He's sort of floated around with both of them, and I've always loved the fact that I have got 2 or 3 sets of eyes, I think, and they don't always clash with their purchases, and they probably look at each other's purchases sometimes and say, I wouldn't have bought that, but I work on the fact that it's a numbers game, and they're both good at it. They've both got a slightly different eye, and I dare say all shapes and sizes do seem to win races, and between the two of them, they just buy enough nice horses that we seem to get enough up here, which is always pleasing.
Moving on now, Tim, the story I penned earlier the week on Run the Numbers about, look, a Street Cry is one of my favourite success stories in Australian, secret success stories in Australian racing. We know about Winks. We know the fact he was champion Australian sire during that era when Winks was dominant, but his record he obviously died at a relatively young age, I think 2014, but his legacy as both a stallion, a sire of sires, but then even more so as a damn sire influence is enormous. He's had 5 individual Group 1 winners in Australia this season in that role, the latest being Idle Fly, who won the Queen of the Turf on the weekend. I think, I went back 3 seasons and saw that, he's pretty much got 10 individual Group 1 winners, and the next best is Fastnet Rock on 7 as a broodmare sire. And then when you go right back and you look at all the most influential, sires and dam sires and broodmare sires across the 21st century in Australia, his percentages are just quite extraordinary for those elite horses. And there's so many times when you sit there and you and I probably, because we're bits of breeding nerds sometimes, we'll sit there and go, oh, there's a Group 1 winner. Most of the time we'll know who it's by, but we won't necessarily know the damn sire straight up. But we'll look at it. And the amount of times when you sort of come across and go, oh, it's out of a Street Cry mare. I mean, it's quite a remarkable influence for a horse that probably, we don't talk up there with, the Dane Hill and Reduced Choices and even Fastnet Rocks and these types of horses. But his influence is quite telling, isn't it, Tim?
even, we talk about shuttle stallions now, too darn hot, and those that are coming down and making an impact, and, it's probably turned the breeders thinking a little bit to support or being a little bit more open-minded about the shuttle stallions given their impact. But sort of look back a decade or so or a bit further and Street Cry, what he has been able to do down here, and obviously with the heavy prevalence of Danehill blood, his mares are matching with that and others, and, if you've got one, you'd be well versed to hold on to them.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a tribute to the global game that's become in the 21st century. We probably saw in the 2000s, when Dalius sort of established himself in Australia and then obviously bought out the Woodlands operation and worked through that. It's pretty amazing to see the impact over the course of, these things happen over 20 years and sort of built through. And sort of, I think we mentioned last week about Yulon, they're buying horses and stallions and mares now that in 15, 20 years' time will have significant effect. The other issue in the wagering space, Tim, I wanted to mention was the foal amnesties, which closed this week, I think on Tuesday. It appears that there have been, a few bits of paperwork that have been cleared up and a few foals that have been, or yearlings that have been cleared to run, which is good. I think there were 3 that went through the yearling sales this year, that including the Savabeel How Romantic, which I think we've mentioned several times, that have been cleared up, and so they will therefore be free to be registered and run. That's a good result, but I think the sort of overriding feeling here is that this was fine to clean up some of the issues the last couple of years, but the system's far from perfect, and the breeders are still gonna have some issues around this, and that it's absolutely worth their trouble double-checking every time that they register a foal or whatever else, that it actually has gone through and everything's fine, because I think it's fair to say that the current studbook system is less than perfect.
Yeah, there could be the Paul Erickson's told me previously, the CEO of Racing Australia, they have improved the IT systems, but as we know, it could be a lot better, as you say, and hopefully in the next few years, that is a project that Racing Australia undertakes, not just to do with the stud book and registering foals, but across the board with Riser or Racing Australia site with the nominations and all the back end, and improving that, probably bringing it into this decade has been a good servant, but it could be a lot better.
Yeah, this decade's probably generous, Tim. It could be this century, I'd argue. But anyway, it feels like I've been using the stud book in the same format for a good 25 years, but maybe I'm showing my age there. Yeah, an interesting one. I think it's one that I'd like to resolve. The following segment is brought to you by Inglis. The progeny of Extreme Choice proved a market sensation at the recent Inglis Easter yearling sale, and buyers will be afforded a significant opportunity to access his progeny at the upcoming Inglis Chairman sale. The entry of both Hazelbrook and Sizzlefly means there'll be a trio of mares carrying what are widely regarded as some of the most valuable pregnancies in the Australasian bloodstock market, joining fellow headline Newgate Farm mare Kiki Express. Hazelbrook shapes as one of the best credentialed broodmares to be offered for sale in 2026, while Sizzlefly is a stakes performed mare with natural speed and a type of profile that continues to resonate strongly with the market. Also joining them is stake performed mare Vestas. The English Chairman sale has established itself as one of the premier breeding stock auctions in the world, consistently delivering world-class results for vendors and buyers alike. The 2026 edition will be held at Riverside on Thursday, May 7th, continuing a where elegance meets excellence theme with a late afternoon start of 4 p.m. AEST. To view the Chairman sale catalogue, go to english.com.au. Moving on to racing now, Tim, and the announcement early this week, or yesterday, I think, Steve McMahon. Probably no surprise, really, to see him being put into the ATC chief executive job on a permanent basis. He's obviously been in the interim role since September. He's got a lot of experience, Steve. He's been a guest on this program. I think it's been a really interesting period for the ATC. I think it's fair to say what's gone on over the last couple of years, but certainly the last 6 months. There is a sense about the ATC wanting to sort of crack on and move beyond all the turmoil the last couple of years. Look, Steve has been a part of that, I suppose, what's gone on, but there's also a sense that he's really quite a steady hand, and I guess he knows a lot about the way things are set up and where things are going to move forward for the turf club.
Yeah, I think the ATC, as you say, does need some sort of stability, and Steve provides that, and said this publicly and privately. I think that I can only judge people on the way my dealings with them and my brief dealings with Steve, including on this podcast, have been, excellent. And so wish him all the best, and obviously with the board, and there's still a lot to play out with whether the appeal from Racing New South Wales, and which is set down for I think 28th and 29th of May. So there's a bit to play out, but at least hopefully they can move forward and try and sort of think a bit bigger longer term than just the next few weeks and carnival to carnival and some of the training infrastructure and different things that some of the projects that I know the board want to get on top of as well.
Yeah, but I think the good folks at the ATC will know that things are sort of a bit more steady when they're not getting a phone call with your name on it at least once a week. Tim, we're trying to work out what's going on or what the reaction is to the latest thing. I mean, there's been plenty of drama. Yeah, I mean, if you compare that with what it's gone elsewhere, it's quite extraordinary. But yeah, it does feel like a bit more of a, moving back into business as usual as opposed to sort of the chaos of the last couple of years. Interesting one. We obviously had a cracking edition of the Queen Elizabeth Stakes on the weekend. We saw Autumn Glow's colours lowered for the first time by Sir Delius. The immediate question sort of popped up in my mind after the race, Tim, was whether Sir Delius would be eligible for a Cox Plate, or would he have to go through additional vet checks and X-rays given the challenges last year? The answer came out of Racing Victoria earlier this week that they were happy for the horse to come and run the Cox Plate without additional vet checks or without additional scans. They're happy with what New South Wales have done. If they want to run the horse in the Melbourne Cup, he will have to get a scan, which is sort of part of the procedure sort of moving forward. So look, I think it probably raises some questions about the process and the robustness of the process and whether, all that sort of stuff. But what it does do for me is it gives us a bit of certainty here moving forward to go, look, the best 2,000 metre weight for age horse in the country at the moment will be running in the best 2,000 metre weight for age race in the spring, albeit the Cox Plate's at Flemington this year, but it's a race we always look forward to and that we'll talk about, given, depending on what Autumn Glow's doing, she's an alibi, but there's a whole bunch of other horses as well. These are the things we're talking about, and it's nice to have that all clear for Sir Delius moving forward.
That was a great race to watch, and really, as I said, sort of the tempo sort of played into his hands. A really strong horse. Well, if they're clearly targeting Brendan and Ark and targeting Melbourne Cup last year, 2000 is probably the bottom end of his distance range or his mile to 2 miles. Really versatile horse, and it was good to see. And I doubt we'll see him nominated for the Melbourne Cup this year. Just A, he's still an entire, and B, probably avoiding that the X-rays just pre-Cox Plate like happened last year, and hopefully everything goes smoothly, stays sound, which presumably no reason why you shouldn't, and can go on and win the race at Cox Plate at Flemington.
Yeah, it'll be a fascinating race to see how that pans out. As I said, there's a few more things to fall across the next little bit, which we'll see what happens. I just wanted to reflect too, as it's the last day of the Sydney Autumn Carnival this week. We've got 2 Group 1s, Tim. We've got the All-Aged and the Champagne Stakes. Firstly, the All-Aged, and just looking at it from a stallion point of view, I suppose, I think there's 3 colt/entires in the race. Angel Capital, who dead set is screaming out to win a race like this. I wouldn't surprise if he bobs up. Royal Patronage and Baywalked. Well, I just wanted to pick your brain a little bit on Royal Patronage, Tim. It sort of occurred to me that probably under the radar as a stallion prospect. He's a Group 1 winner in Australia, won a Canterbury Stakes. Where does he sit? Where would he sit as a overseas bred son of Wooten Bassett that would come into Australia and find a spot on a possible spot on a stallion roster, do you feel?
Well, I just went and looked back at his race record before we started recording, Brent, and obviously he's a very, very good horse. He won the Canterbury Stakes last year. He did win it 2 in Europe, so he's ticked that box. I don't want to be unfair or brutal because he's a very, as I said, I'd love to own him. He's a very nice horse. Would he find a place at start in the Hunter Valley? Perhaps, but I'm sort of thinking maybe New Zealand's a better spot for him, just with that, longevity, raced on, as I said, could win first up, win at Canterbury Stakes at 1,300, did win it too, but probably just given he wasn't exposed here until an older horse in Australia, that probably the Hunter Valley might not be his best serve. That doesn't mean he won't end up there, but I would think New Zealand more likely if he is to go to stud, possibly even, he could be sold overseas, South Africa or something. I don't know, but I think there is some South African connections in that horse, perhaps. But yeah, I'm saying New Zealand. I'd have New Zealand favourite.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I guess he comes out, if he wins the All-Age, probably be upset, but, probably would stand in. But I reckon there have been lower credentialed European horses that have come out here and stood at stud without racing in Australia. And at least you've got the certainty of the fact he actually had won a Canterbury Stakes, which is, it's not a terrible Group 1. It's a decent Group 1 event, and he's second in a Doncaster. He's probably not fast and forward Australian prospect, but I don't know. I kind of feel like there might be something there. Looking at the Champagne Stakes, an open race outside of Campione d'Italia, who was obviously the size winner and a fairly impressive size winner at that. Wouldn't surprise to see him go on. 7 colts looking to stamp their stallion credentials here. I just went through the record. There's 6 previous winners of this race currently active at stud in Australia. So I guess probably the Champagne Stakes. Look, if I'm going to be of our 5 Group 1 2-year-old races in Australia, it's probably, it's probably 5th or 4th or 5th in terms of ranking, in terms of how we see the race, in terms of its importance. But, history would indicate there's some very good horses in this race, and you got to be a strong and progressive enough 2-year-old to be able to succeed in a race like this.
Yeah, and there's some, beyond Campione d'Italia, there's a Fireball that won the Millennium and sort of probably been a little bit unlucky and, came from sort of well back in the size to finish third. Zambale's a Pinatubo, which, if he was able to knock one off, that'd be good for that shuttle stallion, as we were talking earlier about the importance of shuttle stallions at the moment. South End's another interesting one by Palace Pier, who he only obviously came out for 1 year, but there's a few nice horses by him out there as well.
Yeah, there's a bit to play out. It'll be an interesting race to see how that works out. And as I said, probably not the most highly ranked of 2-year-old Group 1 race in Australia, but the record's pretty strong with those horses that come through it. Moving on to wagering now, Tim, and the story from you this week. The big bookies getting their own back, I suppose. We covered fairly extensively the great run of results that the bookies had. Sorry, the great run of result the punters had during spring, and the big bookies sort of felt a bit of pain, and everyone was pretty on good terms with themselves about that, because it's good for good for the game when the punters are winning. But it certainly appears like this spring in particular, sorry, this autumn and this last week in particular was very positive for the big bookies.
Yeah, well, I was interested talking to Entain, and they sent through some sort of information and data and different things. It's probably just the shift, and it's obviously not just Entain, it'd be across the board, particularly the bookies with the biggest market share, Tab and Sportsbet and so on, that punters just love piling into the multis, identifying 2 or 3 or 4 horses on a Saturday, but just, the high profile horses, they look over the line. And as we know, Autumn Glow got beaten on Saturday, which would have wiped out quite a few multi-players or multi-bets. But what was interesting is Entain said even if Autumn Glow had won, they still would have finished in front on the day. So that just probably shows the Sydney Cup was 50 to 1, and the Oaks was won by a favourite. But I guess just the way the results have fallen, the way punters are going, I'd say recreational punters. It's been a tough autumn. It tends to happen in Sydney, I think, and with that, and sort of the second part of that story that I wrote, Bren, was the professional punters, I guess, or the syndicates, and there's a few of them around. They've conversely had a very strong sort of start to the year, or first 3 months of the year, I would say, with, talking to a few different bookies have backed that up. And their bet is, they bet multiple codes, and they're betting, on a Monday as much as on a Saturday. So it probably doesn't discriminate in that sense, but they've had a very good run, which makes it, the bigger bookies can absorb that relatively easily. With the smaller bookies, sort of it hurts them more, given they don't have the sort of customer base to cushion the winning bets.
Yeah, it seems like a bit of a theme, Tim, across racing with the trading base, with breeders as well. The smaller guys, it's harder because they get a bad result. It really impacts them, where the bigger guys can absorb it a bit more. And there's certainly a sense with the big bookies that they're much more pleased with the way things are working out. I think also sports betting as well, Tim, and something we've spoken about a lot, like a couple of upsets in the footy. It's hard at the start of the year to get a read where both AFL and NRL, where a lot of the money goes to, and where things sit. And so I think this time of year, it sort of sets them up pretty well. So interesting one. Also an article I'll urge you to check out too on prediction markets, which I penned earlier in the week. Obviously not a factor in Australia at the moment, Tim, but what is interesting is we're seeing it that the effect of prediction markets move beyond the US. Obviously, it's been a phenomenon in the US. Betfair in the UK are trialing something on their beta sort of platform on Betfair trading, basically for Betfair Predicts, I think it's called. Sorry. So moving to the UK. What my article does do is look at, like, I guess Betfair is an interesting example, because when Betfair came into Australia, it caused a lot of consternation and caused a lot of questions about the future of things, but also had a whole bunch of consequences which you wouldn't have anticipated at the time, including some major regulatory consequences. If Betfair had not come into Australia and they sort of started operating in Australia in the sort of 2003, 2004, but then were licensed in Tasmania in 2006, if they hadn't have come in and done that, and then the Western Australian government then tried to ban them or banned them effectively, which was then challenged in the High Court successfully by Betfair, that High Court case opened the whole can of worms for where we are now in terms of the corporate landscape in Australia. So I guess my point is, if a prediction market tried to establish itself in Australia, and at the moment there's a few blocks around it, but nothing expressly illegal about operating prediction markets if they could be licensed in Australia, if you can get them licensed, what would happen? Would there be legal challenges? Like, it could be the fact that it could shake up the markets in ways we can't anticipate. So I just think it's worthwhile considering the fact that we live in a global world. A lot of our major players we spoke about before, about the big bookies, with the exception of Tabcorp, but Entain and Flutto, who own Sportsbet, are global players, and they're determined by global trends, and so we could see a change in the Australian market because of this. It's worthwhile just keeping an eye out. I'm not guaranteeing it will happen, but the old butterfly wings, if something's going on in the States, it will certainly impact what's going on over here, as well as we know, not just in the wagering world at the moment, Tim. There's plenty going on. Okay, thanks for joining us on Straight Talk, brought to you by our fabulous sponsors, Inglis and Darley. Don't forget to give us a rating wherever you're listening to our podcast, and be sure to subscribe. Send us an email at editor@straight.com.au if you've got any suggestions or anything else. Thanks for your time, and we'll talk to you again next